All right, welcome everyone to our afternoon session on resource monitoring. So in this theme we're going to be exploring how we can adequately monitor recreational fisheries with a focus on novel methods of data acquisition and stock assessment. So we'll get started with our first speaker, Lisa Chong. So Lisa is a PhD candidate at the University of Florida and will be presenting on incorporating socioeconomic uncertainties to improve management and placement of artificial reefs.
Oh no. Do I keep going?
Can you try and find your name? I don't know how it all works.
No, these are just the
You
title.
might need some tech support.
Yeah, I can't see where the mouse is over there. Okay.
You're not here?
Alright, so today I'm going to give a talk about a modeling framework that incorporates artificial reefs into fisheries. So those artificial reefs are man-made structures that are placed in the seafloor, and they're typically used to enhance fish populations, improve recreational fishing opportunities, and provide socioeconomic benefits such as bringing in tourism or diving opportunities. And then, so there's been a lot of research on fish ecology, but we know that when you place artificial reefs, they have impact on fish, so such as enhancing their survival. So artificial reefs also have some impact on fishers. So, for example, if it's placed, then it's likely that fishers will be able to find it and increase their catchability. And then finally, artificial reefs are considered a fisheries management tool, so that's how it's integrated with fisheries management as well. Given that it affects the fishers, and management, it's important to note that we have to then consider them in the social ecological framework in order to understand how each component affects the fishery, and then how the linkages between each component result in certain outcomes. So the focus of the species of focus I picked is the Gulf of Mexico red snapper, because artificial reefs are very popular in this area and with the red snapper recreational fishery. And a lot of the catch from artificial reefs contain red snapper. So like nearly 20, so red snapper catch rates are up to 20 times more on artificial structures than natural ones. And then, there's really high importance of artificial reefs in this fishery. But there's so many questions that we haven't answered. So one of them is, to what degree does attraction or production occur on these reefs? And then do artificial reefs actually enhance, for example, catch rates? And then there's also a concern about whether having more of these artificial reefs are concentrating effort and in the beginning of the season and then leading to shorter seasons. So this leads to my objectives of this this project. So one is to assess how artificial reefs actually affect fisheries management decisions and outcomes, and then depending on whether attraction or production is occurring, then determine if artificial reefs actually have an impact on season length. And then finally, we want to integrate put the placement of artificial reefs into actual fisheries management, as that's not really a thing in the United States. So one way to incorporate all the social ecological components is through a management strategy evaluation. So the simulation framework tests and compares management strategies. And then you could look at different management objectives. So for example, if you want to look at how the fishery does in terms of fish productivity, or if it leads to higher catch rates, and you could compare between the two. So I'm not going to talk too much about the modeling because no one likes that, but I'm going to talk about some important components. So one is the operating model, which simulates the true population dynamics. And then the other one is the management model, which mimics how the regulations are done, and in this case, how artificial reefs are placed. So we created a spatial model, and this represents part of the Panhandle, Florida, which is west and north. And so it's a grid system, and in each cell you could place as many artificial reefs or natural reefs as you like. And then on the shore you could place landing sites, so where the fisheries come from. And then because of this grid system, I could control how the fish and anglers are moving through the space. And then, yeah, obviously this is based on the red snapper, and in order to tune it, I used values from the stock assessment and literature. And then so the first 50 years, I assumed that there was actually no additional artificial reefs. I just took the ones that were historic up to 2018. Then the next 50 years after that is when I do all these artificial reef placement rules. And then, so yeah, during these scenarios, I have to do 200 just to incorporate process error of like recruitment or observation error like on catch. So we don't really understand how artificial reefs actually affect red snapper. So that's what I'm exploring with different scenarios. So the first assumption is that artificial reefs have some biological benefit of decreased natural mortality. Then I'm assuming that they have social benefits of increasing catchability. And then the last one is the combination of both. And yeah, I just like increase or decrease this value at artificial reefs by 25%, just arbitrary value. Then this is the management model. So like I said, it's where you place the artificial reefs in the grid. And yeah, good thing it's kind of working, but you could kind of see the black, I guess, triangles being placed, and that's being done every year. But so the artificial reefs are being placed every year, but how they're being placed changes every 5 years. And this is just to mimic the stock assessment process that we have in the southeast of the United States. So one placement rule we did is just random placement of artificial reefs. It's anywhere, it's just random. So then the other one is not as random, but these are being placed closer to the historic artificial reefs, and as you can see, that's essentially closer to shore. And then lastly, I'm going to present the rule that we created. So, oh wait, sorry, that's really tiny, but essentially we're using the how the trends in spawning biomass changes. Oh, and so the trends increasing or decreasing will tell you how we place artificial reefs. And then we're doing this by clusters. So if the spawning biomass is increasing, then essentially we say that you could place artificial reefs near other ones. So essentially that's closer to shore. And then if the trend keeps continuing, then you could place it in areas of high effort, and that's determined by the operating model. But if the spawning biomass is decreasing, artificial reefs have to be placed in areas of high recruitment. And if this trend keeps continuing, then we start implementing artificial reef fishing closures by just increasing it at 10% every time it keeps decreasing. So these are the objectives that we want to look at. So essentially, one is the conservation one. So are we able to reach this biomass above the 26% of unfished biomass, which is the reference point for the red snapper? Then we have a social objective, well, two social objectives. So one is seeing if they could actually give long-term catch, and also if season length decreases or if there is able to increase. So I'm going to show you some just like very preliminary results for this project. So on the left is a time series. So again, the first 50 years are the same, and then it's when I explore different placement scenarios and assumptions about how our fisheries affect fish and fishers. The blue is the completely random. The orange is near, like essentially closer to shore and near our fisheries. And then the green is our rule. And then on the right is the violent plots, which you could pretty much interpret them as box plots. But to note that these are all the values across the last 50 years. So we're looking at spawning biomass, and also to note that the red snapper stock at the moment is at 18% of the fish spawning biomass. It is lower than the 26, but the population is considered as rebuilding. So the only time that actually reaches above that 26% is when we assume that our fisheries do provide some biological benefits, so that's the decreased natural mortality. So if our fisheries do increase catchability without decreasing natural mortality, then it actually, all scenarios, it leads to this further depletion of the red snapper population. And then our fisheries placed closer to shore actually results in decreased spawning biomass, which actually is not a surprise. So then now we're looking at catch. So catch, these results are a bit of a surprise, but catch will only increase if if our fisheries provide decreased natural mortality. And then also there's a smaller increase in catch if our fisheries are essentially placed closer to shore. And this is a bit of a surprise, but there's no increase in catch if we assume that our fisheries only increase catchability. Then we're looking at season length, and there is actually pretty much no major differences in season length between the different assumptions and strategies. So again, to our surprise, that increasing the catchability doesn't decrease if you assume that our fisheries decrease our catchability, then it doesn't lead to decreased season length. So there's a slight increase if you assume that our fisheries do provide decreased natural mortality, but it's really not that significant. So that kind of leads us to this question of how our fisheries actually, what role they play in the red snapper fishery. And as you can see in my results, that the localized effects are possible. So in the red box, that's where our model is. And yeah, that's a very small portion of the entire Gulf of Mexico. But yeah, we picked this place because it has a lot of natural and our fisheries. So we see that in some scenarios, increased catch, and also spawning biomass. So we know that is possible. But then if you go out to a larger scope, is what does that actually mean for the whole Gulf of Mexico? So there was a study that was done with our fisheries, but they looked at commercial landings, and they found that localized effects do matter in the commercial landings. But on the other hand of the argument, artificial structures only make less than 22%, because this 22% consists of other types of habitat type. And then another study found that only 13.3% of the red snapper are at artificial structures. So then, it kind of brings us to the question of how we could actually integrate our fisheries and fisheries management. So it seems like in the preliminary results that the location of our fisheries do matter. So we replaced, the random placement essentially brought all our fisheries in areas of high recruitment. And then when they're placed closer, then you got less spawning biomass and catch. So it seems like the location actually really does matter, which is not much of a surprise. But in a lot of the scenarios, but remember there was only that one scenario where it went above the 26%. It won't allow the rest, any of the scenarios, and placing a large amount of our fisheries might not actually let the red snapper population fully recover. And we really needed to reach that 26% because, yeah, the red snapper has been depleted for decades. So this emphasizes the need to incorporate the deployment of our fisheries with the stock assessment and fisheries management. And then lastly, we did want to answer this with our placing our fisheries, which actually shortened season length, and the preliminary results show that they really don't, which is a little unfortunate. But yeah, that was the assumption that a lot of scientists thought was happening. But I think one reason why I also think that we didn't really see any results is because I didn't incorporate like the calculation of spawning biomass with the stock assessment process, and we didn't set any catch limit that would stop the fishing if it was below the 26%. So if I added that, maybe that'll change the results. So I'm going to show you some next steps here. Yeah, so there's a lot more work that could be done. But I think the most important thing that we want out of this project is being able to convert this into a decision support tool, so like an interactive model where we can incorporate stakeholder engagement, especially in creating these artificial reef rules. But yeah, let's be real, I'm not an artificial reef manager, and anyone I'm working with aren't like experts in artificial reefs. We are experts in fisheries, but yeah, being able to incorporate the two together would be great. And yeah, I'll answer questions at the Q&A, and that's my email if you have any additional questions.
All right, thank you so much for that, Lisa. So next up we have Andrew B.
Correct.
Andrew is a senior research scientist with the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development in Western Australia, and we'll be speaking about the economic value of freshwater put and take fisheries in WA.
Roger that.
Excellent.
All right. Where am I?
You know what you're doing? 'Cause I don't.
No. End slideshow. All right. Do it. Oh, dude, it's not a touch screen. Right. Come, baby. Voila. All right. I'm Andrew Beer. Thanks for coming to the talk and welcome. I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging the TOs of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and similarly acknowledge the Noongar people of southwest of WA and the land, the Noongar Budja, on which this fishery operates, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. So I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Paul McLeod from Economic Research Associates. So he's created most of the architecture of this project, and I posed the questions and cajoled the participants to get involved. So I out myself as not an economist, but this information is very important for me. Okay, so the southern inland freshwater fishery, it's a bit of a mouthful. So from here I'll just refer to it as the trout fishery, even though there's cobbler and redfin in it, but we only stock brown and rainbow trout. It's very popular, so there's about over 9,500 licensed anglers in that. There's also under 16, you can participate without a licence, and Indigenous people can also do that. So it may be anywhere near 15,000, so we just don't know, but I'll be looking at that sort of number. So the economic side of things, that's what this is all about today. Historically, Pemberton's had been the heart of trout operations for 90 years, and we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the department to operate the facility just last year. So, you know, West Australians are and are very proud of the technical achievements of those pioneers, Glue, Kelly, Shoebridge and Co. Yeah, and of its day, it was very much cutting edge out in the middle of nowhere, 350 k's south of Perth. So It's also somewhat of a, well, it's important as an alternative to the marine fishery. A lot of people, they don't want to go out on a boat to sea, so they get sick. So, I've been told quite a few people do participate in the fishery because of that. Right, so, oops, that was a bit aggro. There we go. All right, so in terms of the location, we commenced stocking around dwelling up about 100 k's south of Perth, all the way through to the Karri forests of the southwest. So on that thin strip of land, it's also pretty close to the populations of the southwest. In the north, it's in the Jarrah forest, cutting through with the groundwater streams off the scarp. In the south, it's more associated with the rivers and streams that run through the Karri forest. In between, there's about 8 big irrigation dams that service the milk bowl of Western Australia. So it's a relatively small fishery in the total numbers that we put out, and we're coming down from 200,000. This year will probably be less than 150, but it's biomass that counts, not tails. And we're really constrained by productive waters, and at that latitude, between about 32 and 34, if you think about other places in the Northern Hemisphere, it's equivalent to like LA, Georgia, Lebanon. So it's pretty low latitude and very low altitude. We're running at about 150 metres. So why do we need to know what the value of the fishery is? Well, I started 3 years ago. I didn't have a background in trout, so I want to know the nuts and bolts of this fishery. How does it work? And we didn't have a contemporary understanding of the regional expenditure or angler attitudes. And I've had to redesign the stocking program based on placing fish where there's demand. And of course the biological side of that. But we also need to invest in production systems that protect fish from high summer temperatures. So that investment in RAS systems and aquaculture technology is going to cost us money. So we're going to have a compelling case to take to government. And that's all driven by fairly substantial changes in the climate. So what we already know, look, our deeper data research teams, the survey teams, they've got a great data set going back on catches of browns and rainbows, redfin, cobbler, all those things through the phone recall survey. But the types of questions that I really wanted to know, what made the fishery tick and who was spending what and where, that wasn't covered. So that's what we asked. Previously, there had been the study on the economic dimension of rec fishing, published in 2018. That was done by my co-author Paul with Bob Linder at ERA, and along with collaboration with the team at DPIRD. That didn't disaggregate the freshwater activity in the fishery, and that's what I really needed to know. And $2.4 billion, politicians, people start to take notice. I would like to avoid the term weaponising that, but I've certainly seen how effective it's been when it's been rolled out in the media. It gets attention. So how do we do it? Right, at that time, so we ran the survey in springtime last year. There was a lot going down in the Western Australian recreational fishing space. I'll leave it at that. But we brought people in to participate in an online survey, but concurrently, Paul and I identified our freshwater licence data, and we did some demographic stuff to try to line it up with that, and also other stuff we know from the survey team. So basically, we leaned on our communications team, partnering with Recfish West, to basically reach out to anglers to say, look, please participate. I would talk at events and really just email people and go the direct route. So it wasn't a phone survey or anything like that. So it was pretty quick and dirty in many respects. And what did I want to know? So we, I put together 57 questions, and kudos to the respondents that actually got it to the end. But I was looking at the spatial stuff. So certainly we did talk about where they fished, what they caught, what they let go. But also I was really interested in the financial stuff. What would they buy? How long were they going with who? That sort of social stuff is, to me, quite important in terms of the economic argument. And management, we asked open-ended questions about how we might be able to improve the fishery, and asking them their satisfaction with the fishery around a number of elements. So like a value sort of judgment. So on the demographics front, look, they look a bit like me. White, predominantly male, they hold multiple licences, they, there's pretty high household income, and about half of them earn more than 100 grand. So, we're talking typically pretty cashed up blokes. And the 8% female participation is certainly something that we can work upon. So you can see in the graph there the top 10 licensed hotspots. So that's pretty consistent where we also put the fish and where our anglers come from. So, look, they're typically very experienced. They're connected to others that enjoy their freshwater fishing. They're avid, they're committed, they're definitely travellers, and mostly they're fishing in impoundments, but some committed river fishers and others that go to small creeks and streams. And that probably partitions the different angling types, whether it's bait, lures or fly fishing. All right, and they love boating. So this is an everyman's boat fishery. So with most of the people on the water in a kayak or a canoe, and as you know, you can get a used sit-on kayak for a couple $100 or spend a few thousand. So typically they're relatively small boats and access on the water was high. Right, so diving into what did we actually ask? So we asked about average expenditure across these categories: boats and their upkeep, guides, their gear that they bought throughout the year, or in a year, their accommodation and the trip consumable costs. So things like fuel, bait, ice, beers, the whole works. So it was quite comprehensive, and we've been able to break down each of these elements so that we can roll up an aggregate expenditure estimate. So, the old saying, bring out another 1,000, or in this case, it's about 3 if you buy a new one. So, largely about $1,100 per annum on operations and maintenance of the boat. So these are all, one of the things that I was very keen to make sure was that these numbers were very plausible and very relatable in that fishery. Gear. Look, there's many ways to spend tons of cash on gear. So buying some lures for each trip easily costs $20. New rig to add to the forest of rods or the latest reel and fly lines. Waders and a camo hat pretty quickly tallies up to that $1,100 a year. A question we pondered, but it's pretty hard to answer, is what proportion is spent in regional general stores or at a servo versus a metro big box tackle shop or online. We're going to have a bit more of a look in that because that's where those dollars become sticky at a regional level. And they're gear-intensive methods with high-value equipment. They're travellers. They love to go in the car, sometimes up to 1,000 k's. The Peel and metro populations are sort of 100 to 300 kilometres from those from these main hotspots where they fish. So the average round trip is about 320 k's. So doing some calculations based on consumption and fuel cost rolls up at least $600 a year. If I drive to Pemberton, it's about 750 round trip and then some. So if you're travelling that sort of duration, you're going to have to have some accommodation when you're out there, averaging about 2 nights away per trip. These are about $100 a night, $1,100 a year, really do check out. So most places visited at Pemberton, Collie and Harvey, and that's consistent with where we would expect them to be. So variable trip costs up around $500 per trip. So with as that rolls up, again, that's plausible. But if you're doing 10 trips a year, or 18 days fishing each year, it quickly rolls up to over $9,000 a year. So they're spending significant amounts of money in the region. So this is the money shot. But I expect the reality is that this is a model and it's all based on the number of licence holders we have, by the participation rate and by the roll-up of each of these variables. So, look, if we're able to get a better handle on participation, currently we estimate it's at 46%, which is the published data in the State of the Fisheries. It gives us a number of about 38 million, which in context in the Western Australian economy, our wine production is very famous, and that's valued at about 75 million last year's ABS data. So, this is definitely a sleeper when it comes to its regional value. So, is it worth it? So basically, we asked anglers around their general satisfaction on this Likert scale, very familiar with that sort of stuff, and did it offer value for them? Similar trends to this, so 80% of people were satisfied or better. Similar trends on quality and quantity of fish were reported. And this is a really interesting one. One way to assess how committed anglers are to a fishing activity is to consider their likely reaction to a change in the price or cost of undertaking the activity. So we asked them various scenarios, whether if price went up or a little, medium or a lot. And basically they came back and said, we would persist. And so we did some more calculations and looked at the price elasticity of the demand, and it's under one, substantially. And so the economics guys will tell you that these are goods that consumers have no substitute for. And so, water, medication, cigarettes. So if you're addicted to it, I think those fishing addict stickers are a real thing, and I'll out myself as a fish dealer. So we also asked some of the social and health questions around that, so we can understand what the social and health outcomes were. Certainly getting outdoors, being able to spend time with their friends, but also, some weird ones about, 18% of people wanted to spend time with their others or their friends, and 18% also wanted to be away from people, so got to try to figure that one out. But, and why they were out there, the other things that they were doing, just enjoying the great Aussie outdoors. So, we also asked open-ended questions about what would you improve if you had an opportunity to sort of design your own fishery, and what detracts from your experience when you're out there. And these word clouds are really fascinating in terms of guiding the conversation for future work. And look, that's a very complex thing to unpack, and it certainly gives ourselves and our stakeholders plenty more to do. And it really just starts to put some points on our conversations. So look, coming up, we've got to complete the report and publish. Basically only got the data a couple of weeks ago, so it's pretty early days. Dive deep into it, and then work with the various researchers within DPIRD about, can you help us to interpret some of these stats? Did you know this? Talk to management and executive about the value and the importance of this fishery, and also talk to our other stakeholders about helping them to getting them to help us unpack what some of these other things may mean. And in terms of improving on the future stuff, a lot of it's outside of DPIRD's remit, and so we need to form some partnerships and have the conversations with them about how we may do that. Particularly putting together better ramps and things like that. And infrastructure to support our stocking, that's the business case I'm putting to government in this coming year. So this certainly provides us with a great influential tool to be able to drive that conversation. And as they say in surveys, so I've been told, your best survey's your next survey. So we'll be lining up to do another one in the next 3 to 5 years, so we can, further sharpen our understanding of this fishery. Right. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Andrew. Some really interesting stuff coming out of those surveys. Our next speaker is Brett Ingram. Have we got? Yep, excellent. Brett is a senior scientist with the Victorian Fisheries Authority with over 30 years' experience in fisheries and aquaculture development. Brett's session today focuses on using reports cards to inform anglers about the status of popular recreational fish and fisheries. Thank you, Brett.
Right, how do we get this?
You need to exit out of it, use the mouse.
Okay.
And slideshow.
Fantastic. Work out how to drive this thing first. Well, I guess one thing I've learnt from the last few days of this workshop, the conference, is that as fishery scientists we tend to accumulate absolutely tons of data. And the challenge for us, I guess, is just, you know, how do we explain the trends in what we see in this information that we collect about the status of the fish and the fisheries that we're monitoring to our primary stakeholders for recreational species, and that's the anglers. And it's a pretty big challenge in its own right. I'll get there. Yeah. So all this information, when I talk about that, we're talking about information coming from different sources, whether it's, you know, dedicated fishery independent surveys, angler diary records, creel surveys, even just knowledge from anglers, and information about the general biology of the fish that we're looking at. And I guess a good example of that is, you know, how big they are when they're reaching maturity. And of course the regulations that we apply to those fisheries. So I guess one solution that we're thinking about and have been looking at is generating really simple report cards for the anglers. Taking all that information together, putting it together, manipulating it, analysing it, synthesising it, visualising it and simplifying it so we can put it into a format that's useful for an angler to digest or understand. And to that end, we come up with the idea about using fishery report cards, or just a simple health check for the fish, the stocks or the fishery that they're interested in. And this is the approach that we've been using for a number of our different fisheries, probably for about the last 5 or 6 years or so. We want to use multiple lines of evidence to describe those fisheries. In that case, it might be information about the abundance or the catch indicators, the size structure of the populations, the presence of recruits, how many mature fish are present, are there multiple year classes present, but also amalgamate with that angler knowledge. And these are the guys that are out there fishing for these fish, and we see it as being fairly important in terms of trying to capture that in the process as well. When I talk about simplicity, we've gone away from trying to think about complex graphs and all that sort of information, and we've basically broken it down to a series of arrows or ticks or crosses to describe the results that we're seeing. In terms of information about what the anglers can tell us, you know, what's the percentage of the fish that they're catching that are legal size. But at the end of the day, what's important for us is that what we're presenting to the anglers is consistent, and it's in a concise format that they can consume pretty quickly and easily. So we've been doing this now on a couple of different fisheries. We started with our wild trout fisheries in the mid-2010s, and we've progressed from there into some of our coastal fisheries, and more recently also looking at some of our inland native species. In the early reports from the 2015s, they were fairly simple approaches, but I guess over the years as we've gone through these different fisheries, we've evolved and progressed the way we present the reports. The wild trout fisheries reports, they started as part of our wild trout fisheries conferences, and over a period of about 5 years we generated reports on an annual basis, and we presented the results at our annual Talk Wild Trout conference. We focused on rainbow trout and brown trout, and you can see up on the next slide where we've been fishing. And usually about 6 to 11 streams a year. We collect data by electrofishing, so a sort of standardised survey method in the streams that we looked at. It's one annual survey a year, and then what we try to do is condense that down into the format for the reports. We combine that annual fishing survey data with some of our historic records and goes back right back even into the 1990s. So it's a fairly long, extensive list of information that we can draw on to do that. So again, we tried to put these into like a 2-pager. On one side of the page we had a description about where and when we surveyed the waters. We had a map of where we surveyed. We added in there what we thought were the important health indicators, as I mentioned, abundance, size, structure, and we tried to then give them an overall rating As you can see, we've used ticks and crosses to describe how we thought they looked, and when we put in an overall rating, we went along the lines of saying, well, it was low, or was it moderate, good, or very good, or excellent. But we also thought it was important just to put some monitoring results in there as well if the anglers wanted to, dig a little bit more deeply into what we were seeing. So that was page 1. The second page, we just added that little bit more detail around what the size structure of the fish were, what the number of fish we were catching per effort over a given distance, and we included a statement about what we thought the state of that particular fisheries was. In those days, they were very simple. A lot of the ways we scored our ticks and crosses were a little bit subjective, but we've moved on and tried to improve the process. The next batch of report cards that we've since done have used not electrofishing data, but angler data, and in this case we're using data from the Angler Diary fishing program, and that commenced in fisheries in Victoria back in 1998. It involves in excess of more than 1,000 angler trips a year and 7,000 hours of fishing per year. So it's quite a large and substantial database. We cover off on 7 species, and this is mostly around our coastal waters. So some of our most important recreational species in Victoria. And this graph here just shows those species and the largest fish that were caught in the 2021 season. The report cards themselves are evolved a little bit more, but again, essentially we're trying to keep it down to one to 2 pages of information. In this case, you can see that we've talked about our performance measures or indicators, abundance trends, and in this case, we've decided to look at changes in abundance over 5 years or 10 years or in a longer term. And in this case, for recreational fisheries from the Angler Diary program, that's going back to 1998. We've also got information about the size structure, and we'll also add in there some angler knowledge information, not acknowledgement knowledge, but angler knowledge. And so we think, their opinions about what's happening in their fisheries is important. Below that, we've got a little statement about that particular fishery, a map of where we focused on for it, and then in terms of the trends and how we scored them. In this case, we started to use arrows and ticks. So an arrow up and a tick basically indicated that it was, the trend or the measure was increasing, or it was positive and it was good, whereas opposite to that was an arrow down or a cross or decreasing. If we had what we thought was a stable trend, then we used a stable indicator. If we thought we had insufficient information, then we just put a question mark in there. So again, just trying to keep it very simple. Again, on the next page after that, we summarise the information, giving a little bit more detail if the anglers wanted to dwell into it a little bit more. Trends in catch per unit effort, size structure across the last 5 years, and just information about what we caught in the last 12 months. And that gets us on to the third of our report card series, and this is on native fish. And this is a cross-agency program. We work in collaboration with the Department of Environment, Lands, Water, I don't know what they're called now, I think they've recently changed, with the catchment management authorities, the Victorian Fisheries Authority. We use funds from the Recreational Fishing Licence Trust, and that funds the work for these particular surveys that we've been running annually since 2017. Again, electrofishing, we do 8 to 14 sites in each river when we survey. The surveys are done annually, and again, we're looking at those measures that are important to us in terms of trying to come up with a status for the fisheries. Abundance, size, structure, and for anglers, the percentage of fish that are in illegal size. And in this case, we're dealing with 9 species in both coastal and inland rivers. This is just an example of the largest fish that was surveyed in 2020. And I'll just note there that there's 2 fish in red, so it's not just about recreational species that we're dealing with here, but also species that have got some level of conservation or endangered status. So in this case, Macquarie perch and trout cod are good examples. They look the same. I'll get there. The report cards look the same, so we're trying to keep that consistent approach. So you can pick up whether it's an Angler Diary report card or a trout report card,
or a native fish report card. They look the same. We provide the same consistent information, and hopefully that makes it easier for an angler to interpret what he's seeing when he looks at these reports. Just another thing to note here, you can see for this species, Australian bass, we might not be just assessing one water, but we might be assessing multiple waters for that one species. In this case, Australian bass, it's 2 waters. So we try to do an assessment looking at our performance measures for each water, and then we try to get an overall assessment out of those ratings, and then summarise that for the fishery as a whole. So this same information is also was originally going onto a internet portal to make it much more readily available to anglers, and again just providing the same sort of information about what we talked about in our reports. That portal's actually now shut down, and we've now moved on to another web page which is based at the ARI Institute. There's a little bit of difference from what's being presented on the web page to what goes into the reports. In this case, the reports on the web page is more of a community-based approach. So the fish community, in this case the Goulburn River, whereas we were looking at the species and what that species were doing across multiple river systems. I guess the next stage of that was that if we're doing this for our port and recreational species, can we do more with some of our small-bodied native fish? So last year, for the first time, we thought we'd have a crack at doing small-bodied natives. It's not ideal because the survey techniques we're using, they're targeting large fish and in waters where we think those large fish are. So the waters where small-bodied natives are, backwaters, lagoonal areas, we're probably underrepresenting their presence. So we thought the best way we can deal with this is go down the path of a present absence approach, look at how many rivers they occur in and what percentage of years they've occurred in that. But again, at the end of the day, we applied a very basic assessment, based on their detectability. So I guess it's a work in progress. Last slide. So where are we going from here? I think we've sort of got a fairly good report that we're producing now. Obviously, we're always continuing to try to improve it. They've been well received by the anglers. The process around how we produce them, how we analyse the data is an evolving process. We rely a lot on feedback from other anglers and also our fisheries scientists. But for example, some of the things we might want to try to look at in the future is whether we can standardise the catch data a little bit more better than we do, and refine some of those objective scoring rules around whether or not we've got an arrow up or an arrow down, or is it indeterminate. And I guess, then looking at whether or not we can actually extend it to other fisheries, and a good example might be our commercial fisheries in the future. And I'll end there with acknowledgements. So. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Brett. So next up we have Bill Sawynok, or I should say the award-winning Bill Sawynok. So Bill established InfoFish in 1995 and has become a leading Australian business providing technology-based services to the recreational fishing industry. And Bill's presentation this afternoon is titled Hidden in Plain Sight.
Thank you. Yeah. How do I drive this thing?
Use the mouse.
Ah. My vision's not all that crazy.
Where's the arrow?
Yeah, it's gone.
I actually can't find it.
Ah. That was it. Right.
No, it's not. So it's not just your eyes. It's
No,
it's disappeared. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So.
It's the right presentation or wrong one?
Yeah, that's the last one.
We'll get there.
Just wait till we get to that stuff. Okay, my name's Bill Sawynok. I'm from Queensland and been in the fishing business for an awful long time. The presentation here today is called Hidden in Plain Sight, and it's really based on new insights from tagging or using tagging to track both fish and fishers. Previously, tagging has been mainly used to look at what's happening with the fish. And when COVID came along, we had a bit of a think about, can we use data to look at whether or not we could see what the impact of COVID might be on the fishers themselves. Almost daily there were reports in the media and that about the impact of COVID on various groups within the community, but none of them were looking at fishers. So we decided to see if we could look at the impact of COVID on fishers. And to do that, we decided to use the recaptures of tagged fish as more or less a bit of a random type sample of the fisher population. So the focus shifted from just being on fish to both fish and fishers. And what we've looked at is external influences, COVID only being one of those. Climate events, particularly flooding and droughts, have a much greater impact on fishers and fish than COVID ever did. But before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about who are the decision makers. What's happened there? Most of you, when you think about fishing data and that, you think that the main users of that are fisheries agencies. Well, we believe that there is a much greater group out there than fisheries agencies who use fisheries data. And we've spoken, most of the presentations here have been directed at fisheries agencies and what fisheries agencies are doing. We believe that the fishers themselves are probably the biggest decision makers about where they go fishing, what time, what they're going to target, whether or not they're going to keep their fish or whatever. Other decision makers are politicians. Politicians are pretty big decision makers in the business because they make the big decisions about where they want to see things going. Marine and land park, national park managers also have an impact on fishing through regulations, marine park regulations, land national park arrangements as well. But then we come to things like regional councils. Regional councils have a vested interest in data on the fish and fishers, particularly if they have a water body within their jurisdiction that the people that in that area utilise and visitors that go there utilise. Water managers also have a vested interest in the data. Natural resource management, natural resource groups, they also have an interest in the data. And tourism bodies. If tourism bodies want to encourage people to go to a particular area to fish, they need to have that data. So we see that data is not only the province of fisheries agencies, but the province of a much larger group within the community. And so what tagging can tell us? On the left-hand side, it's what can tell us about fish, and most of you know what those things are. What it can tell us about the fishers is their fishing time frames, when they go fishing, and that can be time of day, day of the week, or year of the month. And that is important if you want to understand the dynamics of what's happening in a particular area. Tagging can also provide information on fishing effort, harvested and released. A lot of people in our tagging program actually provide details on fish that they've kept as well as those that they've tagged and released. It can also provide details on travel to go fishing. If you know where a person that recaptures a fish lives and you know where they're fished, you get a pretty good proxy for travel distance to go fishing. And just fishing locations, understanding where they're actually going is important. And in our program, people volunteer information about the gear that they use, so we can actually track the gear that they use. So moving on to the SunTag database, this is where I've derived all the information from. The SunTag database has been going for 36 years. It covers 30 odd species, 8 of which we call sort of our key species that we're really looking at monitoring. At the moment, we've got 892,000 fish records, 70,000 recaptures, but when we look at the total number of records in the database, including catch and effort information, recruitment surveys, that sort of thing, we've got 1.4 million records there in total. Our aim is to tag between 18,000 and 20,000 fish a year and get between 1,200 and 1,600 recaptures. So it's a reasonably extensive data set. Okay, so the geographic distribution of tags and recaptures, it's pretty much along the whole Queensland coast. The heat map show, the sort of red-orange heat map in the background there shows the where the fish have been tagged and recaptured. The recaptured dots show that a lot of the recapture information comes from pretty much the same area as the fish being tagged. That won't be a surprise. But then we also see what the geographic distribution of fish, fishes that recapture fish where they live.
Showed a similar distribution. Most fishes live in the same area as where the fish was recaptured.
We're getting some
within
feedback.
100 kilometres. But there were also fishes from well inland.
Keep going. Okay. This shows the geographic distribution of those people that are recapturing fish. And as you see, there's a pretty large component of that along the coast. As well as a lot of other areas in Queensland. It tends to be a bit of inland, people living inland as well. But there's also a lot of people that come from other states, particularly New South Wales and Victoria, to a lesser extent from South Australia and the other states. So that provides us with a pretty good data set to actually look at what's actually happening. All that data, we convert that into dashboards. We've been a bit of talk about using dashboards. We use dashboards pretty much exclusively at the moment to provide our information. We have 52 dashboards covering Queensland. We do it on a location basis. It'll be a river system, a regional area, or an estuary, or an impoundment. We try and do it on a locality basis. With those dashboards, we have 1,300 maps and graphs that we keep updating pretty regularly. So there's one hell of a lot of data that's available through those dashboards. Okay, so when COVID hit and we started looking at using the data to look at what the fishes were doing, one of the things that came into play when COVID really kicked in was there was a travel limit put on, or restrictions of travel were placed on the whole community, not just fishers. And there was a 50-kilometre travel limit imposed for 2 months, March and April in 2020. So what we looked at to see this was to see whether or not we could detect any effects of COVID on the fishes. What we looked at was data from March and April the year before, 2019, compared with the data from March and April in 2020. In 2019, about 19% of fishing trips involved a distance of over 50 kilometres. Yeah. And in 2020, that had dropped to 2%. So we actually did see a significant difference in the travel distance. So we could see that there was an impact from COVID. But the impact wasn't uniform. In different parts it was quite different. In southeast Queensland estuaries around Brisbane, during that period, the two blue arrows show that period when the travel restrictions were in place. In southeast Queensland, most people only travel about 20 kilometres to go fishing. Very few travel over 50 kilometres. So you can see that during that period there was no real change at all in the travel pattern of the fishes there. And the same goes for the rest of the year. There was very little difference in the travel pattern between the 2 years. On the other hand, there were changes in fishing effort in the Fitzroy River up in central Queensland around Rockhampton. The Fitzroy River is a barramundi fishery. There's a closed season from November through to January, and then the season opens in February. So in 2019, when the season opened, the number of the distance that people travelled there rose fairly rapidly through to when winter starts. Barramundi are pretty hard to catch during the winter months in the Fitzroy River, so you have a flat period there, and then again you see a rise towards the end of the season. The season closes in October, so just before the end of that season you see a big boost in the travel there. In 2020 there was a pretty good start to the barra season, but when the travel restrictions came in, it just flatlined for months on end until September, and then the recovery was very, very limited. So we could definitely detect changes in fishers' activities and behaviour from the recaptures of tagged fish. More recently, last year we had a flooding effect in the southeast part of the state, and on the left-hand side is Lake Barumba, which is one of the bass impoundments in the southeast corner, and you can see the dots are all fish being tagged during that time. We come to 2022 and there's a big void in there. That was when the flooding occurred. And on the right-hand side, you see the graph showing the cumulative recaptures in Barumba, basically flatlined for most of 2022. And when you look at the previous 3 years, again, you see there was very little difference between those 3 years. So we can detect quite a lot of change in fisher behaviour based on recaptures. This is the net-free zone in the Fitzroy River in Rockhampton came in 2016. On the left-hand map, the upper left-hand map, it shows the distribution of fishing effort by taggers and also recaptures prior to that period. And you can see that most of the activity was in the upper part of the river, not a lot of activity in the lower part. At that time, that was mainly the area that the commercial fishermen operated in. When the commercial fishermen were removed from that, the bottom right-hand map shows that there was a significant effort shift away from, not away, but a much greater effort shift in the lower part of the river as well. Just the two graphs show the size range of barramundi before and after the net-free zone. And before the net-free zone, the bulk of the fish that were caught were all below legal size, and then the average size of the fish shifted quite significantly once the net-free zone came in. And on the right-hand one is threadfin, and again, before the net-free zone came in, the size range was pretty much below the legal limit. Now, the size range, the average size of threadfin is just under 1 metre, and 60% of the threadfin caught in the Fitzroy River at the moment are over 1 metre. They're all trophy-sized fish, and the biggest one recorded so far since then is 1.66 metres, so pretty damn sizable fish. Yep, okay, I'll flip through these. Just another one on effort ship. This is Weeper up in the Cape York Peninsula area. Prior to 2013, the left-hand map shows that the effort around Weeper was pretty close in around the city area or the township area. Not a lot of activity away from it. Over the last decade, we've seen a significant shift in that effort to the creeks to the north. So we can follow a lot of these shifts there, and we've actually used this data to look at the impact of climate change. Where fishers live, this is an example, Lake Advancetown on the Gold Coast. Nearly all the people that recaptured fish in there are local. The circle is about 50 kilometres, and the rest of the people live basically within 100 kilometres there. On the right-hand side, you see the Fitzroy River at Rockhampton again, and there you can see that while there is a fair bit of local effort in terms of recaptures of fish, there's also a much wider distribution from the southern part of the state, inland, and also in New South Wales and Victoria. Oh, we're just about out of time? Yeah, okay. Okay, just on the benefits of tagging, it responds to both fisher and fisher activity. So you do see what happens with both the fish and the fishers. It provides trend data on what's happening there. It's near real time because the data that comes in from both the taggers and people recapturing fish is almost the same day that they're actually out on the water. Quite often it is the same day. So you're getting data in very real time. It's much lower cost because all the tagging is done by volunteers. It certainly engages fishers much better because the feedback mechanism we have to provide feedback to the taggers and the people recapturing fish engages them. Our program is self-recruiting. We don't do any publicity or anything like that to try and recruit people. They find us. And also, the long timeline of data provides the ability to look at this data over a long period of time. Being going for nearly 40 odd years, we can look at that data over that period of time. So 2 take-home messages. Tagging and associated data sets have significantly improved our understanding of what is happening in and above the water, and volunteer tagging programs around the world hold a wealth of untapped information in over 4.5 million tag records. Thank you.
Yes, UK, and are you doing the same?
Yeah, same talk.
Same talk, okay. So yeah, he's replacing Kieran Hyder. Assessing the economic impact of recreational sea angling in the UK.
Great, thanks.
You know how to run this.
Ooh, I know how to throw stuff around the room, apparently.
So if you just close out of it.
Close out of it.
Yep. And close out of it again. And find your...
Okay, hi there, here we go.
And then just PowerPoint it.
PowerPoint it.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for coming, everyone. I find myself in a little bit of a weird position here, taking over from Kieran quite last minute. So I've actually had these slides for less than 24 hours. So hopefully you won't judge me too harshly on this presentation. It's also a couple of levels deep, this covering, because Kieran was covering for Wendy, who couldn't make it to this, and now I'm covering for Kieran. So now I've got all my excuses out of the way, I'll get on with the talk. So here I'm going to be going through some of the economic impact analysis we've been doing on our sea angling diary programme over in the UK. So what does sea angling look like in the UK? Well, back in 2016 and 17, we had around 820,000 people that participated in the activity each year, and they fished for about 7 million days in total. We've noticed a bit of a decline in participation rates in recent years, with that participation figure dropping to around 600,000 people and about 5 million days fished. But the sea anglers actually have quite a decent impact on the economy of the UK, with around a total economic impact of around 1.58 to 1.96 billion in those years that we've done surveys. In the UK, we're quite new to our understanding of how important recreational fishing is. So we're not quite as far down the road as you are in Australia. It's been really fantastic to hear about where we might be in a few years. But because this increased importance is becoming more and more recognised, recreational fishers who've traditionally enjoyed quite a free and open access to the fishery with no real limits are starting to see these limits come in place. And this is sort of causing quite a bit of conflict with the commercial fishing industry, with both of these sectors kind of pointing fingers at each other and saying, you're the problem. And so there's just a bit of conflict. And so our fisheries managers are often coming to us and say, well, I know what the commercial fishing industry is worth because I can look at sales notes. Can you let us know what the recreational fishing industry is worth? So just to give you a bit of overview of how we actually survey this, we do it each year, and we have two separate surveys. The Water Sports Participation Survey for the number of anglers and the number of days they go fishing, because we don't have a licence in the UK to fish in the sea. And then we've got the second study, which is our self-selecting logbook study called the Sea Angling Diary Project, where we get catch and spend rates per angler. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about how we actually use these data and do some quite interesting modelling with the catch rates and the participation rates, I gave a talk earlier in the presentation. So yeah, I think it'd be an interesting listen for anyone that's interested in that, but I'm kind of biased on that. Next slide. So how do we do these economic surveys? So within them, what we're trying to estimate is the total economic impact, the gross value added to the economy, and the number of jobs that the activity supports. We've done surveys of this back in 2016 and 17, but the main thing I'll be focusing on is the results from our last survey of it back in 2021. Within each of the years, we try and minimise things like recall bias by doing multiple waves of surveying, but we didn't do this in 2021 because we'd already put out a lot of surveys on things like the impact of COVID and health and well-being, so we didn't want to really burden our diarists and just get them to stop responding to everything we sent them. So we actually only sent out one survey to them in 21. Within the survey, we asked them to provide expenditure on all their capital items within the last 12 months and what their spend was on the most recent trip. And you can see some of the categories that we get them to fill out in this table on the right here. We also get quite a lot of information on our anglers, such as their fishing behaviour and what their demographic characteristics are. The way we analyse these data is to raise the capital spend of the diarist to the number of UK sea anglers and raise the trip spend to the number of trips that occur in the UK. We do this by post-stratifying based on people's avidity, which is how many days they go fishing, what platform they use, so do they fish from the shore or fish from boats, and what age they are. We then use what's called an input-output analysis, and if you're like me, you're not an economist, you have no idea what that means. What it essentially does is it just takes away the taxes and the import duties that are imposed on the items, so you get a raw figure for how much it's worth to the economy. And you do this using supply and use tables, which give you multipliers that you just multiply numbers together to get these figures out. And what that enables you to do is to estimate these total economic impacts, gross value added, and number of jobs supported. So looking at some of the results from this, we can see that the angler spend is pretty consistent across our survey time series, and you get a pretty even split between the capital and the trip spend. In total, the total expenditure in 2021 was 954 million, which sounds quite a lot of money, but that's actually less than we've been seeing in previous years. But that's predominantly due to that reduced participation rate that we've been seeing in the UK, rather than an actual decrease in the number of the amount that people are spending on the activity. The main thing our sea anglers tend to spend their money on are things like rods and reels and fuel to go travelling to where they go fishing. We've seen quite a big increase in the amount people are spending on boats, which has been quite interesting to see that that's something that we've been seeing across the world as well, as maybe a little bit of a COVID effect. They also spend quite a bit of money on food when they go. And what this does is kind of suggest, alongside some of these lowest expenditure categories, that a lot of our sea anglers do tend to drive quite long distances to where they go fishing, rather than fish just off their local beach, which is quite an interesting thing to find, I think. The biggest difference that we found in the 2021 survey is that a big decrease in how much money people are actually spending on their rods, reels and tackle, which is, yeah, quite interesting, but perhaps a function of them spending all their money on a nice shiny new boat. After running everything through this input-output analysis, which, as I said, removes the taxes and imports, we're able to attribute the spend to each of the different sectors, economic sectors in the UK, and find that the wholesale and retail sector is the sector that's most impacted by recreational fishing expenditure, which kind of makes sense if people are spending most of their money on new rods and reels. Our sea anglers also spend quite a lot of money on the recreational services, predominantly coming from charter boat fishing fees, also repair and maintenance of their boat engines, and also accommodation, which kind of adds to that idea that people are travelling quite far to go fishing. We've seen some decrease in the direct impact as well in the latest survey. So looking at the total economic impact after you run everything through the input-output analysis, we see the total economic impact is around £1.2 billion, creating a gross value added of £310 million and supporting 12.3 thousand jobs in the UK. So it's quite a big employer in our country. But even though these figures sound quite impressive, they're actually lower than they have been in the past, but predominantly due to that reduced participation rate, as I said. We also find that it's quite difficult to use these figures when we're trying to inform our policymakers. And that's mainly because our policymakers tend to come to us with the question of, I know that a kilo of cod is worth 10 quid when it's sold commercially. How much is a kilo of cod worth when it's caught recreationally? And it's really hard to attribute the expenditure to individual species. And there's also a lot of other effects that could be going on, like if people are getting good exercise, is that going to help out? Is that going to give them the exercise that means that they don't have to go to the doctor, and reducing the burden on our NHS? So, just in summary, we've done an economic impact assessment using an input-output approach in 3 years, and we've calculated the total economic impact of £1.2 billion, GVA of £310 million, and 12.3 thousand jobs being supported in the UK. As I said, this is lower than we've seen in previous years, predominantly due to that reduced effort. It's also, what I should have said on the other side as well, is why it's difficult to inform policy makers, is we haven't done any sort of counterfactual analysis on what people will be spending if, say, sea angling was completely banned. And if a counterfactual is, if you think about it in scientific terms, it's kind of like a null hypothesis, where you say, okay, what would you, because people would still spend their money if sea angling was banned, but what that would change, and it would flow through the economy in different ways. And so you really need that figure to actually give an idea of what the activity generates. So thanks very much for listening, everyone. If you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them, but if I can't, I'll happily pass them over to Wendy at my institute who did this analysis, or Kieran as well. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you for that. You did a great job for jumping in at the last minute. I know you're probably all hanging out for a cuppa, but we have got a few minutes for questions to our presenters today.
Zach, I have a question. There's the economic impact, that direct economic impact, and some of the indirect, and I know we want to make things look good as far as the numbers, and this is, fisheries are good. And what about the climate impact? What about the CO2? Is that part of the equation at all around this? And I know it's a negative, but
yeah, it's not something. Yeah.
So it's a negative, but we also need to be honest about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, that, to try and figure out what sort of these negative economic impacts of, say, people driving to where they're going fishing. It's not something we've done, but that'd be a really interesting thing to look at.
Let's write a paper.
Yeah.
Great. Have we got anyone else with any questions? Yep.
Go on.
To you again. I'm sorry. Actually, no, it's under mine. No, actually, I find it very hard to equate how they put a dollar value on satisfaction or enjoyment. To me, it might be worth. Well, I couldn't possibly tell you how much my enjoyment of catching a fish is worth in a dollar value.
Yeah. So if you ask someone to do it, they say exactly that. I haven't got a clue, mate. Like, what are you on about? So there's various survey methods that you can use to try and get at that. Things like stated and revealed preferences, and sort of seeing. So yeah, I'm not an economist, so I'm not an expert in the topic. But there's various different survey techniques where you can try and tease that out of people in a way that you're not just saying, "Tell me how much that catching a fish is worth to you." But yeah. Yeah, no, it's all good. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting thing, and yeah, there are various survey techniques that people use.
All right, you can sit down. I don't have a question for you. We won't test you on stuff that's not your presentation in the first place. But a question for Brett about the fishery report card system. You're putting together a lot of useful information about a lot of species, and it's interesting to see the species level and community level. But what information do you have on who's actually reading these report cards? Which groups of the population, types of anglers? Do you have any knowledge of who the audience is that's actually looking at these year to year?
Look, I guess we have a little bit of information. As I indicated, the first report cards we did were part of this large program we had, which was called our Wild Trout Fisheries Management Program. And as part of that program, we had an annual conference, and we included those report cards in the conference proceedings. We did the same thing with our native fish ones, and they were presented in what we call the Murray Conference, basically a conference around Murray cod, but native fish in general. And the audiences for those conferences targeted recreational anglers. So the sort of numbers we'd be having turn up to those would be in the order of hundreds of people. So we'd like to think we're getting it out to those people on a fairly wide basis through those avenues, through the workshops, the conferences on an annual basis. And again, just the feedback we're getting from interaction with those anglers was all generally very positive.
Okay, so it's mostly targeted at the more avid people who are quite interested in the fishery already, not the general public who fish once or twice a year.
Yeah, certainly more along those lines.
Just a comment to your question, basically. I think the word is willingness to pay. So you give anglers like different, you give anglers like different scenarios. So you catch 5 fish, but they are all small and something like that. And then you have an attribute in it, like you have to pay additionally £20 or whatever we are in. So, and then you can look what they choose and what they are willing to pay for it.
Very, very, very individual thing. You know, I think every single person will give you a different. I catch a cod, I am ecstatic. I catch a cod on one of my own lures, I am 10 times as ecstatic. How do you put a dollar value on that? You know,
I've got a question for Brett. You've got a fair knowledge of the way tagging programs have been used, not just in freshwater in Victoria, but also to an extent in the marine fish. How much application could you see of the sort of presentation that Bill's just given on getting a better understanding of recreational fisher movements and impacts on fisheries?
I'm not sure whether I know enough about tagging like you might suggest, Ross, but I think his presentation was fantastic, and as you can well imagine, the wheels are now turning and thinking about how that can be applied in the sort of fisheries work that we're doing in Victoria, and you know, we might already have the vehicle there in the Angler Diary program where we could take that to the next level and start capturing that sort of information. So I certainly think it's worth pursuing.
Have we got any other questions? One last one.
All right, one for Lisa about the site choice or the general discussion around where these artificial reefs are going in. How much of a discussion is there on placing them in places that may be beneficial to the fish but that are just inaccessible to anglers, not thinking about closing them to fishing altogether, just putting them further away so there's less frequency of trips to them?
So at least in the US, they have several in Florida where it's only exclusive to researchers, and those are not public coordinates. So yeah, they do a lot of research, and especially on like gag grouper, not so much red snapper there, and it's pretty much to enhance their recruitment. Yeah, a lot of it does get tricky, but you put reefs, and you need a research permit for that to make it so it's not so it's excluded to the public. But yeah, a lot of the artificial reefs in the Gulf of Mexico are funded by the oil, there was the oil spill, the BP oil spill in 2010. So disaster funds, anglers. So a lot of these artificial reefs are purposed for recreational fisheries, and then or changing the oil rigs to artificial reefs.
Great, thank you. Last call for questions? No? All right, well in that case, I'd like to thank all of our speakers here this afternoon, and we can go and enjoy some afternoon tea.